The alien tribunal's decision echoed through the crystalline chamber like a death sentence. Margaret Chen, 73 years old with silver hair pulled back in a practical bun, stood perfectly still as the towering Zephyrian judge pronounced her fate. Her hands, weathered from decades of healing work, remained steady at her sides despite the chains binding her wrists. Human designation Margaret Chen, you are found guilty of violating the sacred medical protocols of the Galactic Union. The judge's voice resonated through universal translators. Your unauthorized treatment of a Kethmori child has resulted in severe diplomatic consequences. The courtroom filled with various alien species buzzed with whispers. Some showed satisfaction. Others seemed uncomfortable with the proceedings. Margaret had saved a dying child whose own species had declared untreatable due to religious beliefs. The child lived, but politics demanded punishment. The sentence is death by Vorthak, the judge continued, his 4 eyes gleaming with cold authority. You will be placed in the ceremonial cage with our most sacred and deadly beast. This is the ancient way of our people for the gravest offenses. Margaret's fellow humans in the gallery gasped. Ambassador Williams shot to his feet, his face pale. Your Honor, this is barbaric. She's an elderly civilian medical professional. The judge's massive hand slammed down, creating a sound like thunder. The law is absolute. She interfered with natural selection as dictated by the Kethmori faith. The Vorthak will determine her worthiness to live. As guards moved to escort her away, Margaret finally spoke, her voice carrying the calm authority of someone who had faced death in operating rooms and battlefield hospitals for 50 years. I understand. When do we begin? The tribunal members exchanged glances. Most condemned beings begged, screamed, or collapsed. This human simply accepted her fate with dignity that unsettled them. Immediately, the judge replied, his voice less certain than before. The procession moved through corridors lined with curious aliens. News of the human nurse's sentence had spread quickly through the station. Some came to gawk, others to pay respects to someone they saw as a hero. Margaret walked with her back straight, acknowledging no one, her mind already preparing for what lay ahead. The dragon cage stood in the center of the station's largest amphitheater. Ancient Zephyrian architecture surrounded the massive enclosure, with seating for thousands of spectators. The cage itself was a work of art and engineering, its bars forged from nearly indestructible titanium alloy, each one thicker than a human torso. Inside the cage, something massive stirred in the shadows. Ambassador Williams made one final plea as they reached the cage entrance. Margaret, I'm working on an appeal. The Earth Council is putting pressure on them. This doesn't have to happen. Margaret turned to him with a small smile, the same one she'd given to countless frightened patients over the decades. Thomas, I've lived a good life. I've saved thousands of people. If this is how it ends, so be it. But tell my granddaughter that Grandma went out doing what she believed was right. The guards opened the massive door. The sound of metal grinding against metal filled the amphitheater as ancient mechanisms activated. The Vorthak's presence could be felt even before it was seen, a pressure in the air that made breathing difficult. Margaret stepped forward without hesitation. Behind her, the door sealed with a finality that sent chills through the watching crowd. She was alone now with humanity's reputation and one very large, very angry dragon. The beast emerged from the shadows slowly, deliberately. The Vorthak stood nearly 15 feet tall, its scales shimmering between deep purple and black. 6 powerful legs supported a body built for destruction, while massive wings folded against its back. Its head was the size of a small vehicle, filled with teeth designed to crush starship hulls. Most terrifying were its eyes. Ancient, intelligent, and filled with predatory calculation. This was no mere beast, but a creature of legends that had devoured hundreds of condemned beings over the centuries. The crowd fell silent as the Vorthak approached the small human figure standing calmly in the center of the cage. Margaret showed no fear, no panic. She simply stood there, medical bag still somehow clutched in her free hand, studying the magnificent creature before her. "Hello there," she said softly, her voice carrying clearly in the sudden stillness. "You're hurt, aren't you?" The Vorthak paused mid-stride, its massive head tilting slightly. In the thousands of years it had served as executioner, no condemned being had ever spoken to it with such gentleness. Most screamed, begged, or attacked in desperate fury. This tiny human simply stood there, looking at it with what appeared to be professional concern. Margaret's trained eyes had immediately noticed what others missed. The dragon favored its left rear leg, and there was an unusual dulling in its normally brilliant scales along its right flank. Dried blood crusted around its nostrils, and its breathing carried a slight wheeze that spoke of respiratory distress. "You're in pain," she continued, her voice the same tone she'd used with frightened children in emergency rooms. "How long have you been suffering?" The crowd stirred uneasily. This wasn't how executions were supposed to proceed. The Vorthak should have already torn the human apart. Instead, it stood frozen, studying this strange little being who showed no fear. Ambassador Williams gripped the railing of the observation deck. "What is she doing?" he whispered to his aide. "Being herself," the aide replied, having worked with Margaret during the refugee crisis on Kepler 442b. "She can't help it. She sees a creature in pain and everything else becomes secondary." The Vorthak lowered its great head, bringing its eyes level with Margaret's. Each eye was larger than her head, ancient and wise beyond human comprehension. For a long moment, they simply regarded each other across the vast gulf between species. Margaret slowly reached into her medical bag, movements deliberate and non-threatening. The guards tensed, weapons ready, though they knew their stunners would barely tickle the Vorthak. From her bag, she withdrew a small medical scanner, the same type she'd used to diagnose the Kethmori child. "May I?" she asked, holding up the device. "I think I can help." The dragon's response sent shockwaves through the amphitheater. It lowered itself to the ground, bringing its massive body down to a more manageable level. The gesture was unmistakable, a consent that defied everything the Zephyrians believed about their sacred beast. Judge Vorthak, watching from the high tribunal seats, felt his world tilting. The Vorthak had never shown anything but aggression toward the condemned. It was a creature of divine judgment, not some pet to be examined by an alien healer. Margaret approached slowly, scanner in hand. The device hummed as it analyzed the dragon's massive form, revealing what her experienced eyes had already suspected. Multiple old injuries, improperly healed fractures, infection in the respiratory system, and what appeared to be severe arthritis in several joints. "Oh, you poor thing," she murmured, genuine compassion in her voice. "They've been using you for centuries, haven't they? Making you kill when you're sick and in constant pain." The Vorthak's great head drooped, and something that might have been a sigh escaped its massive lungs. For the first time in decades, someone had looked at it and seen suffering instead of a weapon. Margaret's scanner revealed more troubling data. The dragon was old, far older than it should be according to Zephyrian records. Chemical analysis showed traces of artificial life extension treatments, crude and painful procedures designed to keep the beast alive for its ceremonial role regardless of its well-being. "They've been forcing you to live beyond your natural span," she whispered, horror and anger mixing in her voice. "Keeping you in agony just to maintain their traditions." The crowd grew restless. 30 minutes had passed since the human entered the cage, and still she lived. Voices rose in confusion and concern. Some called for intervention, others demanded patience. The execution was becoming a medical consultation, and it was making everyone uncomfortable. Judge Vorthak stood abruptly, his 4 eyes blazing with fury. "Guards, something is wrong with the Vorthak. The human must be using some kind of mind control device." But Ambassador Williams was already on his feet, his voice carrying across the amphitheater through the public address system. "Your Honor, I object. You said the Vorthak would determine her worthiness to live. It appears to have made its decision." Margaret, oblivious to the political storm brewing around her, had begun her examination in earnest. The dragon remained perfectly still as she checked its breathing, examined its scales for signs of disease, and carefully palpated the swollen joints in its massive legs. "I can help you," she told the Vorthak, her voice firm with professional confidence, "but I'll need access to a proper medical facility and some specialized equipment." The dragon's response stunned everyone present. It lifted its great head and released a sound that had never been heard in the amphitheater before. Not a roar of rage or challenge, but a soft, almost musical vocalization that spoke of hope. In the shocked silence that followed, Margaret Chen, elderly human nurse, stood up and faced the tribunal with steel in her eyes. The amphitheater erupted into chaos. Thousands of aliens began shouting at once, their voices creating a cacophony of confusion and outrage. Some demanded the execution proceed. Others called for investigation of this unprecedented event. The Vorthak's gentle response to the human nurse had shattered centuries of religious and legal precedent. Margaret stood calmly beside the massive dragon, one weathered hand resting on its snout in a gesture of comfort. She had seen the same look in countless eyes over her career. The desperate hope of a patient who had finally found someone who understood their pain. Judge Vorthak hammered his gavel repeatedly, the sound echoing like gunshots. "Order, order in this court!" His voice cracked with the strain of maintaining authority in a situation that had spiraled completely beyond his control. High Priestess Zalandra, the elderly Zephyrian religious leader, rose slowly from her seat in the VIP section. Her ancient voice, amplified by the chamber's acoustics, cut through the noise like a blade. "Stop this madness! The Vorthak is sacred. It cannot be defiled by alien touch." But Margaret wasn't listening to the political uproar. Her attention remained focused on her patient. Through her scanner, she had discovered something that changed everything. The Vorthak wasn't just sick. It was dying. The artificial life extension treatments had pushed its ancient body far beyond its natural limits, and the resulting systemic failures were causing constant agony. "Listen to me," she called out, her voice somehow carrying over the chaos with the authority of 5 decades in medicine. "This creature is suffering from cascading organ failure. Every moment of delay increases its pain." The Vorthak, as if understanding her words, lifted its great head and looked directly at the tribunal. For the first time in living memory, it spoke. The words came in ancient Zephyrian, a dialect so old that only scholars recognized it. Elder historian Kethmore, one of the few beings present who understood the archaic language, went pale. It said, "Please let her help me." A stunned silence fell over the amphitheater. The sacred Vorthak, divine instrument of justice, was begging for medical attention from a condemned human. Ambassador Williams seized the moment. "Your Honors, the Vorthak has clearly chosen. According to your own laws, this creature's will is considered divine judgment. It has chosen to spare Nurse Chen and request her aid." Judge Vorthak's massive frame shook with rage. "Impossible. The Vorthak does not speak. This is some human trickery." But High Priestess Zalandra had gone very quiet, her ancient eyes studying the scene with growing understanding. She had been present for dozens of executions over her long life, and never had she seen the Vorthak display anything but predatory hunger toward the condemned. Margaret, meanwhile, had completed her initial assessment. The scanner revealed a picture of systematic abuse disguised as sacred duty. The dragon had been kept alive through crude medical interventions for over 1,000 years, far beyond its natural lifespan, forced to serve as an executioner while its body slowly destroyed itself. "You've been torturing this creature for centuries," she said, her voice carrying across the silent amphitheater with quiet accusation, "keeping it alive through pain and artificial means just to maintain your traditions." The medical data from her scanner was being transmitted to the station's central systems, standard protocol for any examination. Within moments, every medical professional on the station had access to the shocking findings. The evidence was irrefutable and damning. Dr. Veltar, the station's chief medical officer and a respected Centaurian physician, stood up in the medical observers section. "The human's assessment is correct. These readings show systematic medical abuse spanning centuries." Other medical professionals began to voice their agreement. The evidence was too clear to deny. The sacred Vorthak was not a divine instrument of justice, but a victim of prolonged medical torture. Margaret gently stroked the dragon's massive snout, her touch bringing visible relief to the ancient creature. "I can end your suffering," she whispered, knowing the Vorthak could hear her even if others could not. "But I need to get you proper treatment." The dragon's response sent another shockwave through the crowd. It carefully, gently lifted Margaret onto its back with one massive wing. The gesture was protective, claiming her as something precious to be defended rather than prey to be devoured. High Priestess Zalandra finally spoke, her voice heavy with the weight of terrible understanding. "The Vorthak chooses its guardian," she said slowly, each word falling like a stone. "Ancient law states that if the sacred beast claims a protector, that being becomes inviolate under our law." Judge Vorthak sputtered in outrage. "That law hasn't been invoked in 3,000 years. It's obsolete." "Divine law does not become obsolete," the High Priestess replied firmly. "The Vorthak has made its choice clear. Nurse Margaret Chen is now under its protection, and by extension under the protection of our most sacred laws." The implications rippled through the crowd. Not only was Margaret free from execution, but she now held one of the highest protected statuses in Zephyrian society. The irony was not lost on anyone present, but Margaret's mind was already moving to the next challenge. Saving the Vorthak would require resources, time, and cooperation from beings who saw her as either a criminal or a miracle worker. The dragon's life hung in the balance, and politics be damned, she had work to do. 3 hours later, the Vorthak's holding area had been transformed into an improvised medical facility. Margaret had commandeered every piece of medical equipment on the station, turning the ancient execution chamber into something resembling a modern hospital ward. The irony of healing in a place designed for death was not lost on her. The dragon lay on its side, massive form filling most of the chamber. Its breathing had already improved significantly after Margaret administered basic pain relief and respiratory support. For the first time in centuries, the Vorthak's eyes held something other than pain. Dr. Veltar worked alongside Margaret, his Centaurian expertise in xenobiology proving invaluable. Together, they had mapped the extent of the damage done by centuries of artificial life extension. The picture was grim, but not hopeless. The neural implants are the worst part, Dr. Veltar explained to the growing crowd of medical professionals who had volunteered to help. They've been stimulating aggression centers while suppressing natural healing responses. It's barbaric. Margaret nodded grimly as she carefully examined one of the implants buried deep in the dragon's skull. They turned it into a living weapon by literally rewiring its brain. We need to remove these immediately. Ambassador Williams watched from the observation area, still hardly believing the turn of events. In the space of a few hours, Margaret had gone from condemned criminal to the most protected being on the station. More importantly, she had exposed a system of cruelty that had existed for millennia. High Priestess Zalandra approached the medical area slowly, her ancient frame supported by a walking staff. The other medical staff parted respectfully as she drew near the Vorthak. The dragon's massive eye tracked her movement, but showed none of the hostility it had once displayed toward Zephyrian officials. "I have been a fool," the High Priestess said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of centuries of complicity. "We told ourselves the Vorthak was happy in its sacred role. We chose not to see it suffering." Margaret looked up from her scanner, sweat beading on her forehead from the intensity of her work. "It's not too late to make things right, but I need your help. Some of these procedures will require access to sacred Zephyrian medical texts, ancient techniques that were abandoned when you started the artificial life extension." The implications of Margaret's request rippled through the gathered officials. The sacred texts were closely guarded secrets, available only to the highest religious authorities. No alien had ever been granted access to such knowledge. "The texts speak of natural death with honor," Zalandra said slowly. "We abandoned those teachings in favor of perpetual service. Perhaps it is time to remember wisdom we chose to forget." Judge Vorthak, who had been conspicuously quiet since the legal upheaval, finally stepped forward. His 4 eyes held a mixture of anger and resignation. "Even if we grant access to the texts, removing the neural implants could kill the Vorthak. You would be destroying our most sacred guardian." Margaret's response carried the quiet authority of someone who had faced such choices countless times. "Your sacred guardian is already dying. These implants are causing cascading neurological damage. Without removal, it has perhaps weeks to live. With removal, it has a chance." Dr. Veltar pulled up the neural imaging on a large display screen. The damage was visible even to non-medical observers. Areas of the brain showing signs of severe inflammation and tissue death. "The human is correct. The implants are killing the Vorthak slowly." The Vorthak itself ended the debate. It lifted its great head and spoke again in the ancient tongue, its voice stronger than before. Elder historian Kethmore translated with visible emotion. It says, "I choose the healer's path. If death comes, let it come with dignity." The next several hours became a delicate dance of surgery, diplomacy, and discovery. Margaret worked with steady hands while Zephyrian scholars read from ancient texts that hadn't been opened in centuries. The procedures described were elegant in their simplicity, focusing on natural healing rather than artificial prolongation. As the first neural implant was carefully extracted, something remarkable happened. The Vorthak's aggression completely disappeared, replaced by a calm intelligence that stunned everyone present. The creature that had been forced to act as an executioner for centuries was revealed to be gentle and wise beyond measure. "Look at the brain activity," Dr. Veltar whispered in amazement. The implants were suppressing higher cognitive functions. "This creature is far more intelligent than we ever imagined." Margaret smiled as she worked, her hands steady despite her age. "Animals are often smarter than we give them credit for. They just need someone to listen." With each implant removed, the Vorthak's true personality emerged. It began to hum, a deep musical sound that resonated through the chamber. Other medical professionals found themselves humming along, the sound somehow soothing their stress and fatigue. High Priestess Zalandra wept openly as she watched centuries of cruelty being slowly undone. "We have committed a great sin," she whispered. "How can we ever make amends?" Margaret paused in her work to look at the elderly priestess with compassion. "We start by doing better. The Vorthak is going to need long-term care and rehabilitation. It will need to learn how to live without pain, how to interact with others without artificial aggression." As the final implant was extracted, the Vorthak released a sound that was pure joy. The ancient creature was free for the first time in centuries, its mind its own again. It looked at Margaret with eyes full of gratitude and something that might have been love, but the hardest part was yet to come. The Vorthak's body was still failing, and Margaret faced the most difficult decision of her career. She had the knowledge to heal the dragon completely, but doing so would require challenging the very foundations of Zephyrian society. The revelation came during Margaret's third day of treating the Vorthak. While analyzing tissue samples under a quantum microscope, she discovered something that made her gasp aloud. Dr. Veltar rushed to her side, concern evident in his expression. "What is it?" he asked, studying the readouts that had captured Margaret's attention. Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she double-checked her findings. "The Vorthak isn't just any dragon," she whispered. "According to these genetic markers, this is the last of its species. The very last one in existence." The implications hit the gathered medical team like a thunderbolt. For over 1,000 years, the Zephyrians had been using the final member of an extinct species as an executioner. The weight of that realization settled over the chamber like a shroud. High Priestess Zalandra, who had been monitoring the medical progress closely, sank into a nearby chair. "Impossible," she breathed. "The histories speak of great flocks of Vorthak flying across our homeworld skies." Margaret pulled up genetic analysis charts on the main display. This creature carries genetic markers that indicate extreme population bottleneck. Based on cellular aging and genetic diversity patterns, the Vorthak species went extinct approximately 800 years ago. This individual has been kept alive artificially ever since. Elder historian Kethamore began frantically searching through digital archives, his 6 arms working multiple data terminals simultaneously. After several minutes, his voice cracked with emotion. The records were altered, deliberately. The population decline was documented but classified. By the time the last wild Vorthak died, this one was already enslaved in the execution chambers. The Vorthak itself seemed to understand the conversation. Its great eyes grew dim with ancient sorrow, and it released a mournful sound that spoke of unimaginable loneliness. For 8 centuries, it had been the only one of its kind. Forced to kill while its species' memory faded into legend, Ambassador Williams, monitoring the proceedings from the observation deck, felt his heart break. "They didn't just enslave it," he said quietly to his aide. "They committed genocide and made their victim complicit in maintaining the system that destroyed its people." Margaret approached the Vorthak's massive head, her small hand gently stroking the warm scales. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "You've been alone for so long." The dragon's response surprised everyone. Instead of continuing its mournful song, it began to purr, a deep rumbling sound that vibrated through the chamber. Despite everything, it was expressing gratitude for finally being understood. Dr. Veltar was running additional genetic analysis when he made another startling discovery. "Margaret, look at this." The artificial life extension treatments weren't just keeping it alive. They were actively preventing natural reproductive maturation. Margaret studied the data with growing excitement. "You mean?" "The Vorthak is biologically still an adolescent. Despite being over 1,000 years old, its reproductive system never fully developed due to the medical interventions. It's possible that with proper treatment, natural maturation could still occur." The silence that followed was profound. The possibility of restoring not just the Vorthak's health but potentially its species hung in the air like a prayer. High Priestess Zalandra stood slowly, her ancient frame straightening with newfound purpose. The sacred texts speak of the great flight when the Vorthak would leave our world to find their eternal resting place. We thought it was metaphor, but what if it was literal? What if there are others among the stars? Margaret's medical mind was already racing ahead to the possibilities and challenges. Even if there are others, this individual would need extensive physical and psychological rehabilitation before any thought of reproduction. The trauma of centuries of enslavement has left deep scars. The Vorthak lifted its head and spoke again in the ancient tongue. This time its words carried a note of hope that hadn't been present before. Elder historian Kethmore translated with tears in his eyes. It says, "The little healer gives me dreams of sky songs and star flights." Perhaps the great flight was only delayed, not ended. Judge Vorthak, who had been watching the proceedings with growing discomfort, finally stepped forward. "Even if everything you say is true, the law still stands. The Vorthak is property of the Zephyrian state. Its disposal is our decision to make." Margaret's response was swift and fierce. "That creature is not property. It's a sentient being that has been enslaved and tortured for centuries. Under Galactic Union law, no sentient species can be held in bondage. The Galactic Union doesn't recognize Vorthak as sentient." Vorthak replied smugly. "They're classified as non-sapient megafauna." The Vorthak's response to this exchange was to carefully extend one massive wing toward Margaret, sheltering her beneath its protective membrane. The gesture was unmistakably protective and clearly demonstrated higher reasoning and emotional attachment. Ambassador Williams was already on his communication device, speaking rapidly to Earth Council representatives. Within minutes, he had the answer he needed. "Judge Vorthak, I'm formally requesting an emergency review of the Vorthak's sapience classification by the Galactic Union Xenobiology Council. Under emergency protocols, the subject must be protected from harm pending that review." The legal and political wheels were now in motion, but Margaret's focus remained on her patient. The Vorthak needed immediate care, and the window for successful treatment was narrowing. She had the knowledge and tools to heal centuries of damage, but time was running out. As if sensing her urgency, the Vorthak gently nuzzled her shoulder and hummed a tune that sounded almost like a lullaby. In that moment, Margaret realized she wasn't just treating a patient. She was midwifing the possible rebirth of an entire species. The breakthrough came on the 7th day of treatment. Margaret had been working around the clock, sustained by nothing but determination and the occasional encouraging purr from her massive patient. The Vorthak's physical condition had stabilized, but the psychological damage from centuries of enforced aggression remained severe. Dr. Veltar burst into the medical chamber with excitement radiating from his every appendage. "Margaret, the Xenobiology Council has reached a preliminary decision. They've reviewed the behavioral data, genetic analysis, and linguistic evidence. The Vorthak demonstrates clear sapience markers." Margaret looked up from where she was administering physical therapy to the dragon's arthritic joints. "And emergency reclassification as a sapient species effective immediately. The Vorthak is no longer property under any interpretation of galactic law." The news rippled through the chamber as medical staff and observers realized the implications. The Zephyrian legal system, built around the Vorthak's role as divine executioner, had just lost its foundation. More importantly, a species thought extinct had been officially restored to existence. High Priestess Zalandra approached the Vorthak with reverent steps. The ancient dragon watched her approach with calm intelligence, no longer the aggressive beast of its enslaved years. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of formal apology. "Great One, I speak for my people when I say we have committed grave sins against you and your kind. We beg your forgiveness and ask how we might begin to make amends." The Vorthak's response came not in the ancient tongue, but in perfectly clear modern galactic standard, stunning everyone present. "Priestess of the sky-touched people, forgiveness flows like healing water. The small healer has taught me that anger is a poison that harms the one who carries it. I choose to release that burden." Margaret felt tears streaming down her face. In 7 days, she had witnessed not just physical healing, but the restoration of a being's capacity for mercy and hope. The Vorthak had not only survived its ordeal, but had emerged with wisdom that humbled them all. Ambassador Williams joined the gathering, his expression mixing joy with concern. The good news is that preliminary scans of nearby star systems have detected energy signatures consistent with Vorthak life signs. There may indeed be others among the stars. And the bad news? Margaret asked, though she suspected she already knew. The Kethmori are demanding that you face trial again. They claim the Vorthak's newfound sapience is the result of illegal genetic manipulation on your part. They want you extradited to their homeworld for judgment. The Vorthak's reaction was immediate and protective. It curved its massive body around Margaret, wings spread wide in a gesture of absolute defense. Its voice, when it spoke, carried an authority that made the chamber walls vibrate. No being shall harm the healer of hearts while I draw breath. She who restored my soul shall know only protection while she remains under my guard. Judge Vorthak, who had been conspicuously absent for the past several days, chose that moment to return with a contingent of heavily armed guards. Enough of this madness. The Kethmori demand justice, and Zephyrian law still governs this station. Margaret stepped out from beneath the Vorthak's protective wing, her small frame somehow commanding the attention of everyone present. When she spoke, her voice carried the quiet authority of someone who had faced down death countless times. Judge Vorthak, you're absolutely right that law must be respected. So let's talk about law. Under the recently confirmed sapience classification, the Vorthak has been the victim of slavery, torture, and forced participation in executions for over 1,000 years. Every single one of those acts was a crime against galactic law. She gestured to the dragon behind her. This being has grounds to file criminal charges against every Zephyrian official who participated in its enslavement. The statute of limitations doesn't apply to crimes against sapient species. The implications of her words sent shockwaves through the gathered officials. The Vorthak could potentially file charges against centuries of Zephyrian leadership, living and dead. The legal and political ramifications would be staggering. Dr. Veltar stepped forward with additional data. Furthermore, our medical analysis has revealed evidence that the Vorthak species was deliberately driven to extinction through systematic hunting and capture. What we're looking at is documented genocide, with this individual being kept as a living trophy. The Vorthak spoke again, its voice now carrying hints of the ancient power its species once possessed. I do not seek revenge for past wrongs, but I will not permit further harm to come to those who showed me kindness. The healer of hearts is under my protection, as are all who aided in my restoration. High Priestess Salandra stepped forward, her decision made. The old ways are dead. It's time for new laws based on compassion rather than tradition. I formally declare the Vorthak a free citizen of the Zephyrian Union, with all rights and protections thereof. The political earthquake that followed would reshape galactic relations for generations. But in the medical chamber, Margaret simply continued her work, ensuring her patient was comfortable and preparing for the next phase of treatment. The Vorthak watched her with eyes full of gratitude and something deeper. It had found not just healing but hope for the future of its kind. And Margaret had found something she'd been searching for her entire career. A patient whose recovery might literally change the universe. 6 months later, Margaret stood on the observation deck of the Starship Redemption, watching as the Vorthak spread its wings for the first time in over 1,000 years. The majestic creature had grown during its recovery, not just physically but spiritually. Its scales now shimmered with health, and its eyes held the bright intelligence of a being finally free to be itself. The ship was specially designed for this moment, a joint venture between humans, Zephyrians, and a dozen other species who had been moved by the story of the dragon's liberation. Its cargo hold had been converted into a massive flight chamber, where the Vorthak could stretch wings that had been clipped for centuries. Dr. Veltar monitored the biometric readings from the bridge. All systems show optimal function. Muscle strength has increased by 400% since treatment began. Bone density is within normal ranges for the species. Margaret, you've accomplished the impossible. Margaret smiled as she watched her patient soar in graceful circles around the chamber. The elderly nurse had aged visibly during the intense months of treatment, but her eyes sparkled with satisfaction. We all accomplished it together. This was never about just one person's efforts. Ambassador Williams joined her at the observation window, carrying a data pad filled with updates from across the galaxy. The political aftershocks are still settling. 3 Zephyrian judges have been removed from office. The Kethmori have quietly dropped all charges against you, probably because their own medical practices are now under scrutiny. And the most important news? Margaret asked, though she could guess from William's expression. Deep space sensors have confirmed it. There's a group of approximately 30 Vorthak living in the Outer Rim territories. They've been hiding for centuries, but they're alive and healthy. The news hit Margaret like a physical blow. Her patient wasn't just the last of its kind, but potentially the key to reuniting with its lost family. The implications were staggering. The Vorthak landed gracefully near the observation window and spoke through the intercom system. Its voice had grown stronger and more confident over the months of recovery. Healer of hearts, the star songs grow stronger each day. My people call to me across the void. Margaret pressed her hand against the transparent aluminum window. Are you ready for the journey? It won't be easy, and we don't know what you'll find when you reach them. I am ready, the dragon replied with quiet conviction. But I will not forget the small human who taught an old dragon how to hope again. Your kindness will be remembered in the songs of my people for all generations. High Priestess Zelandra, now serving as the Zephyrian representative on the joint expedition, approached with ceremonial robes that sparkled with starlight patterns. In our oldest texts, there are prophecies about the return of the Great Flight. Many believed them to be metaphors, but perhaps our ancestors were more literal than we imagined. The ceremony that followed was witnessed by beings from across the galaxy. The Vorthak, no longer bound by chains or implants, spoke formal words of forgiveness to the Zephyrian people. In return, they pledged to spend the next century working to restore the damage done to Vorthak sacred sites, and to search for other surviving members of persecuted species. As the ship prepared to depart for the Outer Rim, Margaret faced her own difficult decision. The Vorthak had asked her to accompany the expedition, and part of her longed to see the reunion of a scattered people. But her practical nature reminded her that there were other patients who needed her skills. I can't come with you, she told the dragon during their final private conversation. There are too many beings in this galaxy who need healing for me to focus on just one case, no matter how special. The Vorthak's response was exactly what she expected from a patient who had learned to think beyond its own needs. The healer of hearts must go where healing is needed most, but know that wherever the wind carries me, I will sing songs of the small human who saved not just one dragon, but an entire species. The farewell was tearful, but hopeful. As the redemption departed for the Outer Rim, Margaret remained on the space station already reviewing files for her next challenging case. But she carried with her the memory of ancient eyes filled with gratitude, and the knowledge that sometimes the smallest acts of compassion could reshape the universe. Years later, when the first new generation of Vorthak young took flight among the stars, they would learn songs about Margaret Chen, the elderly human nurse who had shown their ancestor that healing was stronger than hatred, and that hope could survive even the darkest centuries of despair. The dragon had been saved, but more importantly, the dragon had taught its saviors that true strength lay not in the power to destroy, but in the wisdom to heal what had been broken. In saving the Vorthak, Margaret had helped heal not just one being, but the fractured relationships between species that had been built on fear and misunderstanding. The universe was a little bit brighter for their meeting, and both human and dragon were forever changed by the simple act of seeing past surface differences to the suffering soul beneath.